America must win this war. Therefore, I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure. I will fight cheerfully and do my utmost as if the issue of the whole struggle depended on me alone.
I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it, and the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
We shall never surrender.
Welcome back to the War Kitchen's Christmas special. Today we are taking a look at two of the most well-known holiday favorites, gingerbread and the Yule log. The first of our recipes is the Victorian gingerbread cake. We take our recipe from a prominent cook and food writer of the Victorian era, Eliza Acton. Mrs. Acton was the mother of all cookbook authors and a driving force for all cookbook writers of the day. Gingerbread was originally cultivated in China and was used as a medicinal treatment for everything from arthritis to sore throats. It soon made its way to Europe via the Silk Road, where it was used as a meat preserver. In early Britain, it is well known that Henry VIII used ginger root medicinally to ward off the effects of the plague, which didn't really work out so well. But Elizabeth I is credited for creating the first gingerbread cookies that were sold to visitors of medieval fairs or enjoyed during feasts. It wasn't until the reign of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert that the British people enjoyed gingerbread as a common staple during Christmas time. Prince Albert, a native of Germany, introduced Lebkuchen, or German gingerbread, to the British citizenry short after his marriage to Queen Victoria. Christmas was Prince Albert's favorite time of year, and he was an active participant in all of the celebrations of the season. Even Queen Victoria mentioned him in her journal, dated December 24, 1856. She writes, "Albert got up a St. Nicholas, most formidable he looking, in black, covered with snow, a long white beard and red nose, of a gigantic stature. He came in asking the children, who were somewhat awed and alarmed, 'Are you a good child?' and giving them gingerbread and apples." So we can see how gingerbread has become a traditional element of Christmas time, whether it be in a cake, or a cookie, or even candy. But today we are going to focus on gingerbread cake. So to get started, you will want to gather all ingredients and a square 8x8 or 9x9 tin or baking pan. The traditional cake is baked in a baking tin with a matching cover to give as a gift, but today we're going to use a simple square baking pan. Remember, we're trying to conserve as many resources as possible, and most people will already have some kind of simple baking pan. As with most historic cake dishes, we are going to start by buttering our pan so the cake doesn't stick. You can use other things like parchment paper or something slightly healthier like olive oil. It doesn't really matter that much. To start making the batter, we're going to combine all of our dry ingredients first, our flour, ginger, and baking soda, mixing them well and setting aside. Then in a saucepan, combine the butter, brown sugar, and molasses and cook over a low heat until all is melted. Once everything is melted and mixed together, remove it from the heat and add the lemon extract, mixing everything thoroughly. Now back to your dry ingredients. Add the wet ingredients a little bit at a time to avoid lumps, mixing everything constantly. Once you've got that mixed, add in the beaten eggs and mix everything very well. We are adding the eggs last because we don't want the hot molasses mixture to cook the eggs, and adding it to the flour in small amounts will cool it off enough to add in the eggs. Once everything is all mixed together, pour the mixture into your prepared pan and bake at 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 degrees Celsius for about 50 minutes. As with all cakes, test to see if it's done by inserting a toothpick into the center. If the toothpick comes out clean, the cake is done. If it doesn't, cook it a little bit longer, keeping an eye out to not burn it. Once done, remove the gingerbread cake from the oven and let it remain in the pan until it's cool. Once cooled, you can remove it and place it on a platter for serving. You can even sprinkle it with a little powdered sugar if you like yours a little bit sweeter. And there you have it, a simple gingerbread cake that has withstood the test of time. While the United Kingdom had their gingerbread cake, the French had their bûche de Noël, or Yule log. The tradition of the Christmas Yule log dates back to Celtic times before France even really celebrated Christmas. An actual wooden log was lit ablaze at the winter solstice ceremony, honoring the sun and marking the end of the dark days of winter. In 1869, Robert Chambers, a prolific writer of the time, dedicated a portion of his book, The Book of Days, to documenting the history of Yule log traditions. He found that the tradition of a Christmas Yule log was not only a Celtic tradition, but a tradition all over Europe and the British Isles. The history of the Yule log is a bit sketchy, but the rough story is that as Europe transitioned away from paganism over the centuries, the tradition of lighting a large bonfire seems to have transitioned as well. Instead of a pagan bonfire to honor the god Thor, early Europeans in the Victorian era had transitioned to more of a ceremonial log, which was typically brought by the poor land-working peasants to their lord's house. According to tradition, the log was lit from the previous year's charred remains and had to burn the entire 12 days of Christmas to ensure good fortune for the next year. Even in the 1800s, the Yule log seems to be one of those things that nobody is really sure why they still did it, but it was a fun tradition all the same and provided a lot of firewood for the winter season. And over time, people continued the tradition by bringing logs into their own homes. The French also had their own tradition of bringing in a log of wood, usually from a fruit tree such as apple or plum, into the home and placing it in their fireplace. Once on the hearth, it was sprinkled with wine and lit to ensure the grape harvest would be bountiful the next year. It also had to burn for at least 3 days to ensure this good fortune. Once wood-burning stoves became popular and actual fireplaces declined in popularity, the Christmas log went from the hearth to the dining table, where it was decorated with leaves and berries as a centerpiece. Eventually, a French baker had the idea of, instead of an actual wooden log, making it into a cake decorated as a log, and the bûche de Noël was created as we know it today. And for our recipe, as always, we have simplified the traditional recipe to be more reflective of the ingredients that are available in our modern times, and also as resourceful as possible. First, preheat the oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 200 degrees Celsius. And let's begin with the batter. In a large bowl, combine all of the ingredients for the cake layer, leaving out the egg whites, and mix very well. Then, carefully add in the egg whites and fold over the mixture to incorporate into the cake batter. Next, line a standard 10 by 15 baking pan or a cookie sheet with parchment paper with a little bit of paper hanging over the sides. Melt some butter in a small bowl and brush the parchment paper thoroughly with butter. Next, pour the cake mixture onto the paper and smooth out the batter. We are essentially making a very large, very thin cake layer. Don't be too concerned if the batter does not reach the sides of the pan, just spread everything out so that it cooks evenly. Place the pan with the cake batter into the oven and cook for approximately 15 to 20 minutes. Very thin cake layers tend to cook very quickly, so keep a watchful eye on it so that it does not burn or overcook. You can always test with a toothpick to see if it's ready to be removed from the oven. Once the cake layer is done, remove it from the oven and place on top of the stove to cool down a little bit. But do not let it cool down to room temperature. This is very important. Once it's cooled down just enough to handle with your hands, sprinkle the top of the layer with powdered sugar and place another piece of parchment paper on top of the cake layer. We then flip the cake layer over using a spare cutting board to keep everything from falling apart. Now we have the cake layer sandwiched between two pieces of parchment paper. Once the cake layer is flipped, peel the parchment paper off of what is now the top and sprinkle this side with powdered sugar as well, and place a new piece of parchment paper on top. Now this is where things get a bit tricky. Starting on the narrow end of one side, roll the cake into a log with the parchment paper on the inside. If your cake is too thick, it won't roll easily, or it might crack in places. Don't worry too much about that, it will be covered up later. Once you've got it all rolled up, set it aside to cool. We roll up the log now, so that as it cools, it will harden into the shape of a log. The parchment paper is rolled up with the log so that we can unroll it later and add the filling and icing, which is what we'll move on to next, the icing. In a saucepan, combine the cocoa, butter, and milk and bring to a simmer. Just before it starts to boil, or soon after, remove it from the heat and add the vanilla extract. Then allow it to cool to room temperature. Once the chocolate mixture is cooled, you can add it to a bowl and use a mechanical mixer to whip everything up. Gradually add in the powdered sugar until it's mixed thoroughly. Whisk at high speeds for a couple of minutes to add in some air to the icing. This gives it a lighter and smoother texture. You could do this by hand in keeping with our theme of trying to use as little electrical appliances as possible, but it's very difficult to whip up the icing with a manual whisk, so we chose to lean on our appliances to make this process go a little faster and easier. Once you have the icing, we can return to the cake roll. Unroll the cake very carefully and remove the inside piece of parchment paper. As it is now cooled down in the shape of a roll, it will want to return to that shape, so be very careful when flattening it out. On the inside of the cake roll, smooth out a thin layer of icing, and this is where you can get very creative. If you wanted to make a different icing for the inside than the outside, that will work. In our case, to make make the process go easier and tastier, we chose to use Nutella. But if there are shortages in your area, you can just use the icing you prepared earlier. You will have extra. Once you're done with the filling, carefully re-roll the cake, removing the outer parchment paper as you go. And finally, taking your icing, you can cover the entire log as you wish. We placed plastic wrap on each side of the log to make it a little easier to get the icing in the right spots, but you can skip this if you're good at icing cakes. Once covered, use a knife or a spoon to make the log resemble an actual log from a tree. This is where you can get creative or not, it's up to you. Remove the plastic wrap and cut the ends off the log to reveal the rings inside. And there you have it, your very own bûche de Noël, and your gingerbread cake. 2 cakes from 2 different cultures, both steeped in history and tradition, and well suited to provide a festive treat no matter how hard times become.